I don't know if people are looking for advice, but if you are considering writing a memoir, it kind of helps to publish a book of your own erotic fantasies first.
I'm Michael Tamblyn. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the artist, illustrator, fashion designer, Maurice Vellekoop. Over a career spanning 4 decades, his work has been published in magazines including The New Yorker, Vogue, Rolling Stone, Fashion, and Cosmopolitan, and he is the author and illustrator of the books The World of Gloria Badcock, a comic for adults, A Night at the Opera, Maurice Vellekoop's Pinups, to name just a few. His newest book is I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together. It's a memoir of his childhood and early adulthood in the suburb of Toronto, the youngest of 4 siblings in a strictly religious household, and it's about coming out as a gay man at a very particular time in Toronto in the 1980s. Maurice, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
First of all, I have to ask, did you come from your home on Toronto Island?
Yes, I did. I came over on the 9:45 ferry, and it was a gorgeous day.
For those who aren't Toronto natives, and even for some that are, can you describe a bit about where you are living and the specialness of that community?
Right. So Toronto Island is a park. It's about a 10-minute ferry ride from downtown Toronto into Lake Ontario. And there's a small community of houses at the very eastern end of the island. And the houses are former cottages, summer cottages for Torontonians. And there's no cars on the island, and very narrow streets that are sidewalks, and so it's a very peculiar, unique place to be. So it's kind of like being in the country, but also downtown Toronto.
And I lead with that because this is as much a book about, as it is about families and religion and becoming an artist and finding your identity. It's also rooted in this city, in Toronto. And because 25% of Canada has a Toronto yuck reflex, and the rest of the world has a response of Toronto, isn't that the one with the tower? It's worth calling out that this is a book that doesn't just let us into your life, it also lets us sink into the city through your eyes in this beautiful and intimate way. So speaking of your life, going over I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together for this interview, it was surprising to be reminded of how it begins. The title page is a family portrait, but with your father absent and your mother looking off to the side. And then there's a class photo, which of course has been re-illustrated by you. Why lead with these 2 images?
They just sort of set the scene and the time that the first section of the book takes place in. And I think, when you see a row of girls with tennis shoes and knee socks, it kind of brings you back to the 70s, which was the time that I was going to school. And the picture of my family too. It was very 1970s, and we're in our basement with the wood paneling and the paisley curtains, and
I remember it well. The first chapter opens with you and your mother on November 11th, on Remembrance Day, having a day out together shopping in downtown Toronto. Can you tell us a little bit about that day and why that formed the opening for the book?
Mm-hmm. So, yes, so the central sort of conflict in the book, I don't think I'm giving too much away, is between me and my mother. But at the time of the opening of the book, I'm about 4 years old, and we're in perfect harmony and blissful love with each other. And this trip downtown with her is this sort of suspended time that we have together. That's just us being in love and doing all of our favorite things. But I also said it deliberately on Remembrance Day because my parents were Dutch immigrants, and they came over from Holland in around 1950. Partly because of the poor economic situation in Europe. And And they experienced some very traumatic stuff during World War II, and so I wanted to put the war like right on the first page with that Remembrance Day, a specific day that this event takes place on.
And it's interesting that you say that the central conflict is with your mother, because when we meet your father later in this chapter, which takes place on the same day, his presence is kind of the opposite of what we've just seen. He is angry and explosive and, and unpredictable. Set up that dynamic for me between your mother and your father that that really fills the first section of this book.
Yeah, well, it was I guess a kind of a strange marriage. They loved each other, but there were big problems. And as you say, my dad was very volatile, and he could be quite abusive, like verbally, not physically or anything like that, but he could be quite cruel and very, very hard on us kids. So, that was the dynamic.
But the first chapter closes with your dad taking you to see the Walt Disney movie Fantasia. And that was an outing with your father that really had resonance that has lasted decades. You did a wonderful job of capturing what it felt like at a time that was not only pre-internet, but also like before we owned media. If you wanted to see a movie, you went to the movies. When a movie left the theater, it might be gone forever. And this gave you a long-standing quest, obsession, white whale relationship with the 1959 Disney movie Sleeping Beauty. Can you set up that relationship for me?
Sure. So yeah, this screening of Fantasia was like a very seminal thing for me as a small child, and again, not having seen a lot of movies, it just was overwhelming. I don't know if modern audiences or readers could even imagine what that's like, and as you said, that's your only chance to see it. And so I became obsessed with Disney, and I loved fairy tale as a child, and I still do. I started sort of collecting the Disney movies, whenever they became available in theaters to see, and also in brief excerpts that would be on the Walt Disney TV show as a child too.
6 o'clock every Sunday night.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, after Him Sing. Remember that?
I remember there being Beachcombers and White Shadow, yes, I think, also being right before it. Yes.
Right. So I became obsessed with imagery from the film Sleeping Beauty, which for some reason was kept, as they say, in the vault by Walt Disney himself for many, many years. And this became an obsession to see this movie because it looked so wonderful to me and so tantalizing. And so I didn't actually see the film in a re-release until I was 22 years old. But it also sets up this whole idea of yearning that goes through the whole book. And I think that people maybe from my generation, or people who are deprived of like things that films, for example, that they would like to see and you can't see them. It just sets up an idea of yearning as being normal. And the same with the parents too. There's this father who's kind of like gruff and quasi-violent and distant, and you're sort of, as a child, you're always sort of yearning for like a normal, loving, lovey-dovey kind of father, but you just accept that this is what it is because yearning is normal.
There are two big moments where you begin to separate from the life of your parents, who were very much rooted in a Dutch Christian community. One where you wanted to quit the Calvinist Cadet Corps, a version of the Boy Scouts with extra Christianity added. And then again, when you decided to stop attending church. And in both cases, you are filled with dread coming to your parents about it. But your dad just says it makes no difference to him, and it's your choice. Did your sense of your father change or solidify with the writing of this book at all?
Yeah, it did. It certainly did change because I found out things after he passed away, but by interviewing my siblings that I had never learned before, and so I kind of inserted them into the storyline just because they're so meaningful. So, for example, later in the book, I find out more about my dad's actual experiences during World War II, which he never spoke about. You know, it was that generation of men who were just trained not to speak about painful things, and there was no concept of psychology or getting help or anything like that. They just sort of bore it and let out all their rage and I mean my family's not like special in any way. I think there was a whole generation. There's a line that I use in the book where I'm talking to my therapist and she says that cliche about, oh, it's that generation of wait till your father gets home. And I add, yeah, from World War II. Right. Because so we lived with that intergenerational trauma. And where am I going with this?
Well, looking at your parents, you also have to decide how you want to visually depict them. And I'm interested in that process for you because you do such a good job of showing your mother through a loving lens, showing these different dimensions of your father, showing him in states of rage. As you're working through that as an artist on the page, how are you determining like kind of what to dial up and what to dial down, what to emphasize, what to kind of treat with reverence?
Right. So that kind of goes back to the writing process itself. So in my case, what I did was I wrote a script first because I didn't want to start making artwork that I would be changing because of changes in the writing. So I worked really, really hard on having a really solid script to begin with before I started making the art. So for me, that was the most challenging thing about the book was the writing because I've never attempted anything like this before on such a scale. So the visualization of it was kind of the easy part for me because I've been an illustrator for so many years and I have all these little tricks that I can use. But that's not to say it wasn't challenging either because it was so challenging to draw it all. Yeah.
Well, and then, like these are your loved ones. These are people from your life.
Yeah,
they're gonna read it later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Through late adolescence and early college, you've the good fortune of befriending an older couple, Paul and Martin. Can you tell us about how they came into your life and what they meant to you?
Right. So I went to Ontario College of Art, now OCAD University, back in the mid 80s. And one of the most inspiring courses that I took in first year was called Plays and Performance. And it was taught by this man, Paul Baker, who was this incredibly flamboyant gay man who knew everything about everything, opera and film. He had taught film at Western for many years. He had a PhD in English. He loved cinema. He loved soap operas. He just engaged with culture on every level. Mm-hmm. And he was a bit similar to me in the sense that I loved movies and popular culture and high culture, and so a lot of our dialogue is just quotations from old movies. And so, yeah, we just clicked immediately, despite the 20-year age difference. And he became a very, very dear friend, as well as his partner, Martin, over many, many years.
And they seem to provide a space for you to try out an adult version of yourself, and also grow into being a gay man at the beginning of college.
Yeah. No, they absolutely, they provided... sort of a model, I guess. Paul never liked the idea of being a mentor, but he kind of was, and same with Martin.
It at least puts sort of options on the table of
Yeah.
how you can be.
Yeah, exactly. Hmm.
This isn't a self-congratulatory book by any means. There are depictions of you hurting people or disappointing them in addition to the times when you got hurt. And one example would be the tragic story of the very expensive Vidal Sassoon wig that you borrow and then discard in a rage after, I would say, you've had a mostly fun night out. And that's a moment where you probably know that the reader will judge you. Any life story includes these incidental bruisings and mess-ups. How do you decide what goes in, like where you reveal your own self to be less than perfect?
Yeah, that's a good question. What was a big influence on me was Lena Dunham's Girls. And I loved that series, and I loved how awful the people could be, and you still like them and care about them. And that became a kind of an ideal for me to kind of emulate, I think, with the writing and some of those stories, which are quite self-mocking as well, I think. I mean, they're meant to be funny, but there's also a serious, sad side to a lot of them too, which just go to show how fucked up I was, really. So, you want to have a variety of things happening, and left turns in a book to keep interest. And one person said, I don't know who it was, but said that that every book is essentially a mystery novel, because you want to find out what happens. And so when you present these left turns, I feel like hopefully they're creating like that expectation of like, oh, why did that happen, and what's happening next. And another thing that really helped me create this book was the idea of each chapter being kind of almost like a short story on its own. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of the chapters can be removed from the book and stand alone as an excerpt.
Right.
And that just helped me to wrap my head around creating a 500-page book. So the selection of incidents, I think there's a strong logic to it all. Mm-hmm. That I worked out early on in the writing phase.
I have wondered whether some of these scenes that we see are either things that have come up or things that have kind of been burning away inside you that you finally get out.
Yeah, well, I think it's all to illustrate this arc of this story. Yeah. So it's all to serve the story and the really classic kind of hero's journey where the screws get tightened on the protagonist until they either break or survive. So yeah, all of the incidents hopefully increase in tension and pressure onto me, the main character. And yeah, I think because I've heard from a lot of people who've read the book that they couldn't put it down actually. Mm-hmm. and they would read it in a day, and then they'd because they wanted to get to the finish and find out what happened.
Yes. Yeah.
And then a lot of people have told me too that they've gone back again then to try to figure out how I did it.
Well, and one thing that was that I was surprised by was that for a book that was on one hand very episodic, these were very much snapshots from your life, particular periods in your life, it was still propulsive. Like you were still being pulled from segment to segment, even though as a work you could sit it down, pick it up to almost any point, enjoy that moment that we're with you at a particular point in your life, and then put it back down again. So it functions both as a long narrative arc and also as just like we're opening up windows into your life at different times.
Thank you.
Well, and just I think anyone who's lived through that time in their life also identifies just the cringe-worthy nature of figuring yourself out.
Absolutely.
Your 1997 book, Maurice Vellekoop's ABC book, A Homoerotic Primer, it's like a naughty bird-watching guide for gay men. And it's interesting to consider in light of this memoir, where we can see that things didn't just click into place for you as you came out. There was still the big task of figuring out where you fit in yourself, where you fit into the community. And so what was it like to revisit those feelings?
Yeah, it was awful. It was awful. A lot of people, while I was working on the book, which took place over a period of 10, 11 years, okay. A lot of people would ask me, so is this book therapeutic for you? And I would always reply, no, therapy was therapeutic for me. Right. And so while it was painful to revisit some of this stuff, it also helped that I had dealt with a lot of it in psychotherapy. Yeah. Yeah.
How did that book, Maurice Vellekoop's ABC book, and its sort of quasi-sequel pinups influence the writing of this book? They're very different in their, kind of in everything but illustrative style, but it feels like there's connections there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it goes back to the longing, right?
Yeah.
So when I first came out, I had a couple of kind of iffy experiences with men, followed by kind of a brutal assault, and all right at the beginning of the AIDS era. So there's a scene with I have my first sexual partner, and we're talking about this gay cancer that people have been starting to talk about, and as a result of those three things happening around the same time, I just kind of shut down sexually and romantically for like 12, 13 years. So I rarely had sex in the 80s and 90s, and I was very, very unhappy. And I sublimated all of that feeling and all of that pent-up desire and love into these books of erotica. Yeah.
Did putting those fantasies down on paper then make it easier later to show your, what was in your head and what was in your longing as you're writing your own memoir of yourself?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know if people are looking for advice, but if you are considering writing a memoir, it kind of helps to publish a book of your own erotic fantasies first, because
Excellent.
You've already shown, some of your most intimate thoughts and fantasies to the world. So, the writing of a memoir seems almost like easier and tamer afterwards.
But you also have this almost psychological archaeology of having to remember what your fantasies were when you were 14, 15, 16, as well as what they were when you're an adult, which I don't even know if I could remember what those were. Not to spoil anything, but it's striking how much of I'm so glad we had this time together depicts people caring for you as a young man. Was that something that you've carried with you, or did writing this book cast some of those people from your past in a new light for you?
Yeah, I guess I haven't really thought about that. That's a lovely point that you're making. I guess I was very lucky to have those people around. I didn't always appreciate them at the time. That's the thing about exploring memories. I think that taps into that, and it was interesting. Like, the more that I immersed myself into this material, even just like drawing stuff, the more kind of memories came back.
Yeah,
and some of them were quite like really specific things, like the memory of a 1968 Buick in a parking lot in the sunshine, and how that car smells when you open the door with the dust and the vinyl and everything.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, maybe that's a metaphor for some of these people who as you say, who helped me and cared for me during difficult times. Yes, a lot of it came back in the working on of the book.
I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about your career as an illustrator, as an artist, and now as someone who's bringing that together in these bigger collections and books. In my first job in books, as the youngest and most junior bookseller at an independent bookstore, I was given responsibility for comics and graphic novels. And so I was perfectly positioned to first encounter your work in the Drawn and Quarterly anthologies that were coming out in the 90s, and then later Vellevision, your first standalone book. But this wasn't the main focus of your career at this point. So tell me a little bit about how you assembled your career as an artist and as an illustrator before creating these books became, a much bigger part of your life.
Yeah, so I always wanted to be an illustrator. And that's largely because of my older sister Ingrid, who's a very, very talented artist, and she's 10 years older than me, and she went to OCA as well in the late 70s, I would say, and she wanted to be an illustrator, and I just thought, yeah, well, that's what I want to do too, because she's doing it. So, but I also always loved illustration because it was art that was for something. It was for, like, it had a very specific purpose to help to illuminate a story or to, So yeah, most of my career has been, I think of myself mainly as an illustrator still. And then I started drawing comics in art school, and I never, as a kid, I was never really that into comics. Like, I loved Mad Magazine, and me and my brothers, of course, collected Heavy Metal magazine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I still have all of those,
Yeah.
and but I wasn't. I was never into superheroes particularly, and mainstream comics didn't really interest me. And it wasn't until art school when I discovered Raw magazine that it kind of clicked in my head, and I realized, wow, this medium is so unlimited in its potential for what it can do and the variety of approaches that you can take to it. And so, yeah, inspired by Raw magazine, I started doing short pieces, and somehow hooked up with Drawn and Quarterly back in those days. And so alongside all of this illustration work, like, I was busy in the 80s and 90s. I would also take time to write my own little stories. And so I kind of became the queer voice at Drawn and Quarterly, which was nice because it was a very, I think, peculiar queer voice, not so conventional as maybe some of the other gay cartoonists who were out there who I never really connected with that much either.
Mm-hmm. The 80s and the 90s were, in retrospect, kind of a golden age of illustration, of commercial illustration. And you were working at Reactor, which was kind of in a way, like a hotbed of that kind of work. And then every once in a while, you would get some panels together and ship them off, and that would just happen as you had time for it, or as the inspiration struck you.
Yeah, well, there was often a deadline for Drawn and Quarterly,
of course,
when they were publishing an actual quarterly, which in reality came out about twice a year. Yeah. But so that was good to have a little deadline. I'm always good with deadlines. And then the illustration work happened at the same time, and then sometimes there was a bit of crossover back in the 90s, particularly because people who were starting to pay attention to graphic novels like seriously, and I started to get some illustration work that was actually comics. Yeah. So I got commissioned by Vogue, for example, and I did a couple of stories for Esquire. Details magazine, so like one-page comics that they would commission from me as illustration jobs.
That was also the sort of the coming together of, it's hard to call a community, but a bit of a movement of that illustration graphic novel crossover. You had people like Fiona Smythe and Julie Doucette, who also were sort of brought into the Drawn and Quarterly orbit, and each of whom was also kind of spinning out and doing their own things. Who else were you looking at or looking to, who was an inspiration to you at that time, who kind of helped you get a sense of what you could do within this medium?
Well, Seth is an old friend of mine, and I certainly looked to his work. But yeah, I would have to go back to Raw Magazine. Jerry Moriarty was a wonderful, or is a wonderful artist who did these one-page comics that were very enigmatic and very much about the absurdity of life and the banality of life, and that really struck a chord with me. I think he was, I would say, of all the Raw people, he was the greatest influence. But also Mark Baer and Charles Burns, yeah, and then of course all the Europeans too, Joost Zwarte and this guy T-Pex. I don't know if you've heard of him. So I met him in the 90s in Holland, and his name comes from a type of whiteout in Holland. And he's incredible. And since then he's published some major books, biographies of artists. So he did a Rembrandt book, and he did a Warhol book that is just incredible.
As someone who came of age in the 80s and 90s, and as an artist whose reputation was in some ways made through work that was unapologetic about its gayness, is it surprising to you now, not just to publish your memoir, but to do it with an arm of the world's biggest publisher, to have it released into the world where you can talk about it in mainstream channels and reach all kinds of readers? Does that feel a little unreal for you, or is that like, finally we get to do this the right way?
Yeah, no, it's very unreal. The book is out there now. I was in a room by myself for 10 or 11 years, and really not much work happening, which was one of the reasons that I started this project, was to kind of make a mark in some other realm than the world of illustration, which is sort of crumbling around us. So yeah, it's been a big step forward for me artistically, and also it's been getting some good attention, and I have big hopes for its future.
Do you see yourself now occupying more of this space of book-length works?
So there's a few projects swirling around up here in my head, and I do have an idea for another graphic novel, of which I've been making notes about and stuff, but I'm just not ready to start something as huge as that. So I'm pitching a children's book right now, which is something I've always wanted to do. I love children's books, and I collect them, and they're a big influence on me. And I'm also working on some more erotic work too. So we'll see how those two things play out side by side in this conservative world of ours, increasingly.
Well, you've written about how gains made by queer people are presently under threat, and as a writer and an artist, where do you put that concern? Does it go into the work? Does it just remove your stomach lining? Does it go into therapy? What do you do with it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because when I started this book back in 2012, we still had Barack Obama in office in the United States, and progressive causes and progress itself seemed to be going in one direction, and then just in the last few years we've taken this U-turn, it's seemingly in North America and Europe as well. So what I thought of as like a kind of a maybe slightly unconventional white gay man's story at first has now seemed to have come out at a time where it's almost like the world needs this book. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the emotion and thought that I put into this book is coming out at a perfect time for it.
Maurice, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I have been speaking with Maurice Vellekoop, author of the memoir, I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together. Find it at Kobo and Conversations home on the web, kobo.com/conversation, and check the show notes for a link. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode, and if you enjoyed this one, tell someone who you're glad to spend time with. They will appreciate it too. Kobo and Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.